Good morning, and welcome to the FCC's side meeting on satellite licensing frequently asked questions. Thanks for joining us virtually during this busy week at the Small Satellite Conference. My name is Marissa Velez, and I am an attorney in the Satellite Policy Branch within the FCC's International Bureau Satellite Division. I'll be giving a short presentation this morning, followed by a Q&A. I'm also joined by a number of my colleagues from the Satellite Division and the Office of Engineering and Technology Experimental Licensing Branch, and my colleagues will likely jump in as part of the Q&A portion of today's meeting. Throughout the virtual presentation, we'll be accepting questions via email. You can send in any questions you may have to the email address livequestions@fcc.gov. That's all one word, livequestions@fcc.gov. This email address will also appear on a few of the slides during the presentation, so I'll try to provide reminders as we go forward on that email address. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the presentation for today's meeting. This morning's presentation will focus on FCC licensing frequently asked questions with a particular emphasis on small satellite licensing. This is meant to be an informational staff level presentation, so if you have questions about a specific application, I would encourage you to reach out to staff directly. Also, if you'd like more detailed information regarding FCC rules and policies, you can refer to the official documents that are available on the FCC website, a few of which I'll mention toward the end of this presentation as further resources. So we'll start out this morning with a question, are smallsats special? Now, if you're attending this event and others during this week of the SmallSat conference, I would say that your answer is probably yes, smallsats are special. That being said, it is important to understand how small satellites fit into the satellite regulatory framework of the Federal Communications Commission. And the answer is that for FCC purposes, smallsats are and are not special. The first point is that small satellites, like their larger counterparts, must be appropriately licensed. There are no exemptions from the regulatory process based on the size of a satellite, and understanding what is necessary for a satellite to be licensed is an important part of ensuring that the satellite will ultimately be able to launch and operate. Compliance with requirements for licensing of satellite communications is not optional. If you're attending this event, you probably already know that there is a regulatory process, but if you have further questions about what needs to be licensed, I would encourage you to review an advisory that was issued in 2018 regarding satellite communications licensing requirements. And I'll also reference this at the end of the presentation. But the bottom line is that all satellites, including small satellites, from the FCC's perspective, must be appropriately licensed. When it comes to the satellite licensing process at the FCC, though, small satellites are special in some respects. In particular, the FCC has established a new streamlined process for licensing of small satellites under the Commission's Part 25 rules. And applicants can opt into this process if their satellites and system meet certain qualifying characteristics. The advantages of this process include lower application fees as compared with a regular Part 25 license, and generally faster processing times. I'll get into a little more detail, a bit on what the qualifying characteristics are and how that streamlined process works. But it's worth being aware of as you think about FCC licensing, particularly from the perspective of small satellites. And on this slide, I also have the link for the questions, if you have any questions that you'd like us to address at the end of this presentation. So as a basic question, what is the licensing process at the FCC for satellites? And the answer is there are actually 4 different satellite processes. And this applies to non-federal stations, so those stations that would be getting an FCC license rather than going through the federal licensing process. If you obtain a Part 25 license or authorization, and this could be either a regular Part 25 or a Streamlined small satellite Part 25 license, you're able to conduct commercial operations. And looking at these four processes, the distinction is really based on what the purpose is of your satellite operations. So the type of process that you choose to apply under is really dependent on what you're planning to do with the satellite. Aside from the two Part 25 processes, the third process is experimental licensing, and that's governed by Part 5 of the Commission's rules. And finally, a satellite can be authorized as an amateur satellite for specific purposes under Part 97 of the FCC rules. The processes are a little bit different from an applicant's perspective, as I'll explain in a few minutes, but there are some commonalities among all the processes. So, for example, all the processes for applying for a license or authorization will require submission of an orbital debris mitigation plan. In addition, the processes will require an International Telecommunication Union, ITU filing, and this includes cost recovery fees for Part 25 and most experimental licenses. The ITU radio regulations are treaty provisions that are binding on the United States, and the FCC abides by those provisions in licensing satellite operations. So turning now to the specific processes for licensing, first I'll discuss briefly the amateur process. Generally speaking, the FCC has fewer satellites authorized under this process than the other processes. One of the things that I may have heard at other events or from certain small sat enthusiasts is, well, our satellite is an academic project and we haven't launched or operated a satellite before, so we must be amateurs. That's not necessarily the case. Amateur satellite operations are classified according to a specific definition in the FCC rules. And you can see here, there's a number of limitations on the types of communications that would be authorized under experimental or authorized for an experimental satellite. Just anecdotally, most of the research or academic missions over the past few years have been licensed under the experimental process rather than the amateur process. But that being said, there have been some great amateur satellite missions that have been very successful. So this provides a little bit more information on the amateur process. As you can see from the slide, amateur satellites must be appropriately documented from the perspective of the FCC. And this is done through a pre-launch filing, which includes technical descriptions, as well as coordination for use of spectrum allocated for amateur operations. And if you have further questions on this process in particular, I'd encourage you to take a look at Part 97 of the Commission's rules, which again sets out what the definition is of an amateur operation. Turning to the next slide, I'll touch a little bit on the experimental licensing process. This is a process that I think, over the past years has been frequently utilized by academic or research missions. It's also a process that's been used to license technology demonstration missions, for example. It's important to note that, like the amateur process, the experimental radio service has its own definition about what types of communications are permitted. One important point to note about the experimental licensing process is that, generally speaking, it's not appropriate if you're planning to provide commercial service. There are some nuances and exceptions, but I think it's fair to say that if you're planning to provide commercial service, then you should be looking into obtaining a Part 25 license from the FCC. Another important point on the experimental licensing process is that all operators are on a non-interference, unprotected basis. As I've heard reference to an experimental frequency band. That's not something that actually exists. Experimental operations can be applied for in any frequency band, but it's important to understand what the other operations are in the band that's being selected. Even early on in the design stage for radio frequency communications, it's important to be thinking about what frequencies will be used and how those frequencies may be shared with other operators in those frequency bands. If the operations are consistent with an allocation in the ITU or US Table of Frequency Allocations, that may facilitate your ability to operate in the frequency band. But even then, it's really important to know what other operations are in the band. You can find out, are there commercial operations in the band that you're able to find through FCC databases? Is there an allocation for federal use of the frequency band? And what information can you find out about what those operations might be? All of these things can affect whether your proposed operations that you apply for are in fact compatible with use of that particular frequency band. Now we'll get a little bit more into the Part 25 licensing process. And as I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, there are actually two aspects of Part 25 now that are relevant for small satellites. There's a regular Part 25 license and a streamlined small satellite Part 25 license. So first I'll touch a little bit on the regular Part 25 licensing. Part 25 is primarily used for commercial services, but there's no limitation to commercial services. So if you wanted to apply to do an experimental operation under Part 25, you can. As you can see, for the regular non-geostationary orbit license, the application fees are significant. This Part 25 regular process is a process that has been used for example, large NGSO constellations planning to provide broadband. But it's also been used by smaller satellites and systems. So there's really a wide range of systems that have applied for and been granted a regular Part 25 non-geostationary orbit license. And next, I'll get a little bit into the Part 25 small satellite licensing. One thing I did want to mention, though, just in Part 25 in general, if you do obtain a license under Part 25, depending on the frequency band, you may be able to obtain primary or secondary status in the chosen frequency band. And this is different from the experimental process, which would put you on a non-interference, unprotected basis with respect to other operations. And generally speaking, Part 25 does require more detailed legal and technical submissions. But it also shares aspects of the application process with the experimental and amateur application processes, including, for example, submission of an orbital debris mitigation plan. So speaking a little bit to this slide regarding streamlined processing, you'll notice that there's significantly lower application fee associated with a small satellite application applying under this process. In addition, applying under the small satellite streamlined process may result in shorter processing times for your application. The process is really designed to identify those types of applications that are Part 25 applications, but that can be processed in a more streamlined fashion. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what those qualifying characteristics are. As you'll note, the one application is limited to 10 satellites in total, but there are not limitations on the number of applications. So for example, if you have a system that is in development and you have 5 satellites that are being launched initially, and then you want to add an additional 6 satellites, you could apply for the 5 satellites first through one application, and then at a later date, apply for the additional 6, and those satellites could all be considered part of the same system, but you could break it up into multiple applications if that made sense from a business perspective. So I did want to get into a little detail on how you qualify for the Part 25 streamlined small satellite processing. And here, there's a number of eligibility criteria, and we looked at these, the commission looked at these in trying to determine what makes sense as a definition for small satellite. And you'll see that there's a number of criteria here. As I mentioned, 10 or fewer satellites under a single authorization. A satellite mass of 180 kilograms or less. There's also limitations on the time in orbit. So any individual satellite would be on orbit for 6 years or less, and this would include any time to deorbit the satellite, so following the conclusion of the primary operations of the satellite. And And this is important to note when you're thinking about applying under the Streamlined process, because it is different from the regular Part 25 licenses, which are typically granted for a period of 15 years. So this is something to be aware of and think about. As I mentioned, this process is geared towards small satellites as well as some of the shorter duration types of missions. The deployment needs to be below 600 kilometers unless the satellite has propulsion. Any individual satellite must be 10 centimeters or larger in its smallest dimensions, so fairly standard from a trackability perspective. There can be no operational debris released from the satellite. The probability of a collision with a large object during the satellite orbital lifetime must be less than 0.001 per satellite. And several of these are consistent with the calculations that would be performed if you're using a NASA ODAR, for example, format. Disposal must be via atmospheric reentry with a casualty risk as calculated of 0. So this means essentially that you have the satellite is demisable through the reentry process. You have to have the capability to immediately cease emissions by telecommand if necessary to avoid causing harmful interference. And radio frequency operations must be compatible with both existing operations and not materially constrain future operations in the requested frequency band. And this last bullet point is really consistent with the idea that the satellites are having less intensive use of the radio frequency spectrum that's being requested. So this could be demonstrated, for example, through an explanation that the satellite will only be downlinking a few times a day to a couple of Earth stations in the United States or elsewhere, and therefore really would not constrain or materially constrain future operators from entering into the requested frequency bands and also operating there. I did want to note that missions beyond Earth's orbit are also potentially eligible with slightly modified criteria. So for example, there's no requirement for those missions that the satellites be disposed of via atmospheric reentry. And there are actually a couple of other smaller points, but this covers the primary criteria. And if you have additional questions and you'd like to get it, look into more detail on whether the mission that you're thinking about qualifies, I would encourage you to review the FCC's report and order in the small satellite proceeding, and you can get a little bit more detail on each of these bullet points and kind of understand whether your mission fits these criteria. So then the question is, what about orbital debris? I mentioned a couple times that the FCC does require orbital debris mitigation plans as part of the satellite application process. And this applies for all the processes, whether you're applying as an amateur, as an experimental licensee, or under Part 25 of the Commission's rules. So in April of this year, the FCC comprehensively updated its rules for orbital debris mitigation plans. This was really the first comprehensive update since the rules were adopted in 2004. The updates have been adopted by the FCC, although they're not yet in effect. There's still a process where the rules are published in the Federal Register, and so that process has not yet been complete. So the rules are not in effect. Some of the updates from this year include, for example, requirements that applicants quantify collision risk, that they quantify probability of successful post-mission disposal, and quantify casualty risk. There are some additional disclosure requirements on maneuverability, trackability, identification of satellites, and how information will be shared for space situational awareness and space traffic management purposes. So there are some important updates to the FCC's rules, and again, these apply to, or will apply once they're in effect, to applicants both under Part 25 and under the experimental and amateur processes. In addition, this April, the Commission also adopted a further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on additional issues also associated with orbital debris mitigation. And some examples of these are the calculation of total risks for larger constellations when it comes to, for example, collision risk, maneuverability requirements, post-mission lifetime, as well as indemnification and a post-mission disposal bond. The deadline for comments and reply comments on this further notice of proposed rulemaking has not yet been established, but barring anything unusual, is likely to be either later this summer or early fall. And the comments may be filed electronically in the Commission's electronic comment filing system, or ECFS. I did not provide the docket number here, but it's 18313 if you're looking for that. And I would encourage folks, if you're interested in these topics, both in learning about what the updates were to the FCC's rules this April and what issues remain and are out for comment as part of the further notice, to look at the FCC's document that was issued, that was adopted on April 23rd, 2020. And as I mentioned, there are some additional materials that are likely to be useful on the FCC's website when you're thinking about small satellite licensing. In 2013, the FCC issued the International Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology issued a public notice discussing small satellite licensing. It's been a few years, but the points in that document are still relevant for thinking about licensing for small satellites. In addition, I mentioned the advisory that was issued in 2018 concerning licensing requirements that I mentioned in connection with the first slide. And then also I wanted to remind folks, if you have any questions, you can email them into livequestions@fcc.gov. And then just some additional materials beyond those on the previous slide. As I mentioned, we have the report and order and streamlining licensing procedures for small satellites. And this gets into a lot of detail on the criteria for small satellite streamlined processing. And it also includes a discussion of the different licensing processes. So if you want a little more detail in terms of what does it mean to have an experimental license versus an amateur authorization versus a Part 25 license, that document explains a little bit more on those issues as well. In addition, we have the April 2020 mitigation of orbital debris in the new space age reporting order and further notice of proposed rulemaking. And that details the updated orbital debris mitigation requirements and seeks comment on additional rule changes. And that's the April 23rd FCC order and further notice. And so that concludes the short presentation that I wanted to do this morning. I wanted to leave ample time for questions during this side meeting. So please, if you have any questions, you can email them to livequestions@fcc.gov. And I'll come back on for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleagues as well to maybe address some of the questions that have come in if we've received any. So Carl Kensinger is the Deputy Division Chief of the FCC Satellite Division, and I think he's been looking at some of the questions as we've been going through the presentation this morning.
Yes, I have. Actually, we have a number of questions, and maybe we'll start off actually with the first one that came in, which was, does the FCC support licensing by STA? And that stands for Special Temporary Authority. That's a version of an authorization that's distinct from a full license, which for a longer period of time. The special temporary authorities are for 180 days or less, although they can be rolled over. So the question is, satellite licensing via STA, do we support it? I'll just say initially, it's important to remember that the S stands for special and the T stands for temporary. And so these are really meant to deal with situations where regular licensing is not sort of feasible or appropriate, and temporary. I mean, so most of the time, if the operations are going beyond 180 days, that immediately raises a question about whether it's an appropriate vehicle. That said, we have licensed some satellites under Part 25 on a special temporary authority, and that is typically for ones that will operate for a very, very short period of time, like a day or two. And maybe I'll turn it over to, I know, Tony, are you on? Maybe you can address this in the experimental licensing process.
Yes, can you hear me?
Can hear you very well, thanks.
Okay. Yes, we similarly, as Carl mentioned, the authorization would be for 6 months or less, and under the experimental, what these might typically entail, maybe a university scientific small sat that is in very low orbit and has days or weeks of research that they're trying to collect data. So in that case, that type of authorization would be a good fit. And those are the types of requests that would fit under a experiment where they're collecting data, or if they're testing radio for development for space use, or other scientific research purposes that will be for limited scope and limited time. So, yes.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else on the FCC side have anything to say about that? Okay, maybe we go to the next question. And this is also for, I think, mostly for you, Tony. There's a question about what's done for launch licensing and who to get in touch with about that. For them, we're talking about launch vehicle licensing, not the sort of the orbital payload. What's the process there?
Yes, since the launches are date specific, they currently are being done under STAs. Typical applicant would file for a window of opportunity based on weather and any delays. But then there are also frequency considerations. Many launches are on shared spectrum, so they would be coordinated with NTIA on the federal side to make sure there's communications as far as the launch time and event. And then once that launch is complete, that license would expire. So they are done on a case-by-case basis for one launch at a time.
Okay, and I would there is a public notice that the commission put out in 2013 that that provides some additional information about launch licensing. And I think a Google search would probably get you to that. Experimental licensing support for launch licensing, FCC. So I'd suggest that. It may also be cited in one of those documents we have here. The enforcement advisory, I think, may have a reference to it as well.
I don't know if you can see my screen sharing here, but if you're able to see it, the PowerPoint has the link to that document, or the listing of the name of that document that you're referring to.
Actually, it's a little different, Marissa. It's one that was issued, I think, on exactly the same day, but it's concerning launch frequency. So.
Okay, I'm sorry, the wrong one.
No, it's all right. They were companion items back in 2013. So. So I'd suggest commend that to anyone who has that question. We had a couple of questions about satellites that are less than 1U, or thin sats, pocket cubes, and so on. And is there a difficulty with licensing those? How do we handle those at the FCC? So I think there is some discussion of that in the FCC's orbital debris report and order that was just released. The short answer is that if the satellite has a smallest dimension of less than 10 centimeters, it's then handled on a case-by-case basis. If it's larger than 10 centimeters in its smallest dimension, and we're talking about in low Earth orbit, of course, it's considered to be trackable, effectively trackable. But for ones that are less than that, we then look at them case by case. And there's two kind of things to look at. One is the stowed configuration, and the other is the deployed configuration. And certainly a lot of these satellites, as they pop out of the deployer, if everything goes correctly, they're going to get a lot larger, significantly larger. So we look at both of those, but also a question, we have usually a question about the reliability of the deployment. The other question I think that came up is what's the role of, if you, for example, add reflectors or something of that nature. Those are a little more complex questions and get into, I mean, it is something that is outside the normal tracking for sort of plain vanilla tracking, I guess, to use the way it's been described by some folks. And so again, those are looked at case by case. If you have an object that's untrackable by the entire network, but can be tracked by one or two specialized sensors, it's not clear that that's something that that'll be useful for other operators in particular who are trying to avoid the satellite. So those are the kind of questions that come up with respect to those types of satellites. Let me see. We had also a question about, this is also an orbital debris question with respect to the expectation of casualty being 0. And this is one of the qualifying criteria for small satellites. And the question is, how do you demonstrate that? So Marissa, do you want to cover that?
Sure. So again, this is specific to the process for the small satellites. So if you're trying to qualify for the small satellite streamlining, then that's where you would be looking to determine whether your satellite would have a casualty risk of 0. And this is basically as calculated using either the NASA debris assessment software or a higher fidelity model. The NASA debris assessment software will return a value of 0, depending on the inputs, materials, for example, that are being used in the satellite. So it is possible to get a result of 0 using the NASA debris assessment software. And I think that the key point here is to think about use of materials that are demisable during atmospheric reentry. And that's, again, just for the small satellite streamlined process. But that for regular Part 25, for other licensing processes, we would also ask for a casualty risk assessment, but the 0 requirement is not present in those processes.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that the orbital debris mitigation standard practices have been recently updated, and we and include language that encourages design for demise. And one of the questions that's open in the FCC's orbital debris mitigation proceeding is exactly how to assess whether that's been adequately considered in the design process. So I just bear that in mind as well. Okay, additional questions. So this is a fairly easy question. It seemed to be a couple of questions about who to contact and if you're interested in getting a license and whether it's possible to talk to FCC staff in advance of submitting a license application. So maybe Marissa and Tony, if you could touch base or cover that sequentially.
Sure. So we are glad to talk to folks prior to submitting an FCC license to get information on what they're thinking about, to provide initial feedback to the extent that we can regarding the frequencies that are being considered, and any hurdles that may be associated with the application based on some of the anticipated aspects of it. For the Part 25 applicants, there's an email address for the satellite division that you can email, and we can coordinate setting up a call or communicate otherwise based on that. And let me find the email address. I think it's something like satellite@fcc.gov, but maybe I'll verify that. I'll turn to Tony, and then I'll come back and just verify what that email address is for the satellite division.
Sure. For Part 5 experiments, our main FCC portal, you can go to fcc.gov/ELS for experimental licensing system, and that'll take you to the front page where you would submit an application, whether an STA or a longer 2-year license application. And we are available. We're a small shop, but we do work personally with the applicants. And we have a email as well for general questions or help with the system, and it's elb@fcc.gov. But we are available. Folks can get in touch with us to discuss prior to filing, or if you have a specific question, you can just email it, and one of the branch staff will respond. So.
And for the satellite division, the email address I was thinking of is satinfo@fcc.gov. So satinfo@fcc.gov. And the email contact information for the satellite division staff are also available on the International Bureau Satellite Division webpage.
Okay, so we have a question, and it's actually come up from a couple of spots. What about Earth station licensing? We've talked about the satellites, but what about an Earth station? And does the space station, or does the license, a small satellite license in particular, does it include the Earth stations as a part of the license, or is that something that has to be done separately?
So from a Part 5 perspective, it can be both or either. If a satellite is communicating to a specific Earth station that is not already licensed, they should provide the Earth station information. So we'll have the satellite as well as the Earth station information to review as far as coordinating any approval. If they are seeking to use a already licensed either Part 25 Earth station, they would include that in the experiment description as far as who is the licensee. And sometimes that licensee would need either their own Part 5 license or seek permission under Part 25 for their license to communicate to the Part 5 license. We also have the opportunity for folks if they're just seeking to license an Earth station itself, and they would file their own application as well. So each of the combinations is available, and it'll be reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
And then for Part 25, and this is for
Marissa, can I ask you, can you put your camera on when you're speaking? I don't think Tony has a camera, but we'll go ahead so people don't have to look at me.
No, glad to. So for Part 25, and this goes for both the small sat process as well as regular Part 25, Earth stations are licensed separately, so they wouldn't be included in the Part 25 license. So if there's a new Earth station that's coming online, that'll need to be licensed through the Earth station licensing process. Or if there's an existing Earth station that will be communicating with the satellite, then that satellite needs to be added to the points of communication for that existing Earth station. On occasion, there are Earth stations that would want to communicate with satellites that have not, US Earth stations that want to communicate with satellites that have not yet been granted access to the US market. And so in that instance, there would be a application for what's called US market access, which is for the satellite to communicate with Earth stations in the US. And that process would actually include much of the information that would be required for a regular FCC satellite license. But the short answer is that for Part 25, the Earth station licensing process is separate from the satellite licensing process.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about fees. If I am watching a 1U CubeSat, that's a $30,000 fee, right? That's the question. And really a $30,000 fee for a 1U CubeSat. The question didn't say that, but that's what I took from it. And the short answer is yes, the fees are set. The one distinction we have is the set of fees under Part 25 for small satellite licenses. And then again, it's important to remember that there's also for experimental missions, there is the option of the experimental licensing process, and the fee there is $70. So those are, I think, that's covered in Marissa's slides. The other thing I would just mention is that fees are an area that the Commission is assessing. There was some legislation in the last couple of years, and so there is a sort of a comprehensive look at the overall FCC application fee structure. And we also have an ongoing rulemaking on regulatory fees as well. Let me see, we had...
Excuse me, this is Joe, Carl. Just wanted to, you may wanted to mention also, in addition to our fees, that there are ITU cost recovery fees as well, if the filing is submitted to the ITU.
Yeah, Joe, you don't have a camera, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's correct. And actually, one of the questions we had is what the what the range of fees is for the ITU. Can you address that? That's something that when you go to fill out your ITU forms, you can press a button and get that number, right, Joe?
Yeah, that's usually how it works. The commission doesn't set the fees for that, but generally speaking, for NGSO APIs, it's about 570 Swiss francs, and for notifications between 7 and 8,000 Swiss francs. So that's the range usually for the NGSO filing fees.
And am I correct? There's essentially a calculator within the ITU software that.
Yes, within the SpaceCap software, if you use the latest version, it's important to use the latest version of the SpaceCap software. You can get a calculation, do a calculation there, and it'll give you a pretty accurate amount as far as what you'll pay in ITU cost recovery fees.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just tell my colleagues that my connection just timed out. If you have any other questions you've noticed from our feed, if you could jump in while I reestablish a connection to the emails.
Sure, I'm looking over here. So we have a question on when we can expect updated rules related to orbital debris mitigation. And on that point, as I mentioned in this past April, the Commission did update the orbital debris mitigation rules. There's some new requirements and disclosure changes to the existing disclosure requirements. In addition, at that time, there was a further notice of proposed rulemaking adopted that asks additional questions. That proceeding is currently open. The comment period has not been, the comment deadline has not been established yet for comments in that proceeding, but should be established relatively soon. And then from there, there'll be review of the comments and evaluation of those comments and other issues to develop the final determinations. So I don't have an exact timeline on that, but it is something that's underway. It's an open proceeding, and we're going to be looking for comments very soon on those topics. Carl, are you back on, or do you want me to continue with?
Yeah, no, I'm back on. I think the one other question, I think we've covered most of the other ones. I'll ask you to double check me on that. But we did have a question about technology demonstration missions, and the question is, can they be licensed as, this one's for you, Tony, I think, can they be licensed as experimental, under an experimental license?
I guess the definition of technology demonstration, but yes, that would be a category that would fit under an experimental. So whether you're testing a imaging or a circuit communications type technology, or a sensor, or various other technologies to develop for the satellite industry, radio bus, etc. Those would all be areas of scope that would certainly fit under a Part 5 experiment.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'd add to that is that in a way, any mission is unless the technology is completely static, which in this industry it typically is not. But any mission is in some ways a technology demonstration. So I think I would exercise some caution maybe in just labeling. It's certainly tempting to get that $70 application fee to label a mission as a tech demo, and you know, but we will look at what else is going on with the mission, and a lot of those, the technology demonstration is kind of just a part of the normal development of a system, and it's done, as I said, with almost every satellite or every mission. And certainly that's what we see with our operators at geostationary orbit. We would not think of licensing them as experimental. They're very much for commercial purposes. And so if you're looking at a mission that would do both, which is a commercial mission, and you're trying out some new technology, really that kind of pushes the mission over toward regular Part 25 licensing. So this is something where the facts in the individual case are going to make a difference. Okay. Let me see. We may be at the end of questions, and so we don't need to keep everyone. Anybody else? My colleagues see anything?
I did see one question regarding, I think it was a joint amateur experimental license, or issues related to having the experimental and amateur payload maybe on the same satellite. Didn't know if that was something to just touch on briefly during this.
So maybe I'll talk about that a little bit, and then Tony can jump in. That has happened. There've been a couple of situations where there's an initial science experiment that's supported by a radio that uses amateur frequencies, and then at the end of that completion of that mission, the radio is turned over for normal amateur, sort of typical exchange of amateur traffic or something like that. Those are special cases, and they do require some extra work to get them done. But they are ones that we have accommodated in some cases.
Sure. I think this question had come up a lot in the past, but recently kind of has not been on the radar. But just to be clear, a amateur operation under Part 97 is meeting the amateur role definitions, which include communications that's open to other amateurs. So that's one consideration. If you're calling something a amateur satellite, then it must meet the purpose for the amateur rules and would likely be licensed under Part 97. The questions come up when someone wants to use an amateur frequency, then that becomes a little more complicated if it is research oriented and not doing amateur communications, then that gets a little bit more difficult. You need to kind of justify why you would need that amateur frequency, and many times that may get declined, and you should pick a frequency that would be more appropriate to the mission or experiment you're trying to do. Like I said, we had a lot of these early on where someone said, hey, I'm an amateur, I want to use an amateur frequency, but I'm experimenting, so should I get a Part 5 license? So we've kind of separated them out as far as the intent of the satellite operation. So if you're communicating with amateurs, apply for a Part 97 as an amateur satellite. If you're looking to do research and experimentation, you may be better off choosing a non-amateur band and seeking that route. to get your license.
Okay, thanks. I know Marissa is actually headed off to another virtual meeting. So I think we have covered all the comments. I guess we should just wrap up at this point.
Sounds good. I think, and if folks have further questions, as I mentioned, there's the satinfo@fcc.gov email. Myself and Tony Serafini from the experimental licensing branch are going to be participating in an NSF panel that's immediately following this. So we're going to head over there to talk a little bit more about CubeSat licensing. But I think if we've addressed the questions, I just want to thank you for joining us this morning, particularly during this busy week. We appreciate your time. Thank you. And thanks to my colleagues as well for their responses to questions and for the FCC's folks who set up this meeting and organized the streaming and the live questions email. So thanks very much for all of that. Appreciate it. All right. And with that, I will close out the meeting. Thank you.